start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the panel Data Protection in the Smart City that is organized by the SPECTRE project. And before giving the floor to our distinguished panelists, I would like to give you some insights on the SPECTRE research that will set the scene for our discussion today. So the focus is on the smart city ecosystem, where we have intensive personal and other data collection and use. We have a lot of deployment of new IoT, AI technologies, and we have a complex multi-actor environment that challenges the effectiveness of our data protection and privacy frameworks. We have questions like, how can we actually take into account or take into consideration aggregated effects on privacy and other rights that rise in a smart city context? How can we seek the views of data subjects? How can we operationalize this in a data protection impact assessment? Can we include considerations on competition and costs of data protection impact assessments in the smart city market? And what is the role of our local authorities? What tools do they have beyond data protection law to ensure that we have a high level of privacy protection? I would, so this sets the scene, and because of the strong public-private nature of smart cities, they should actually on these themes and topics lead by example. But is this easier said than done? I would like to introduce to you the first panelist that will start giving you an insights on challenges and opportunities in this relation to this topic. Dr. Damian Clifford, a senior researcher in law. He completed his PhD at the Center for IT and IP Law at the University of Leuven, but then left Europe for Australia, and he's now here representing the University of Melbourne, and he will be, as of February, taking up a postdoctoral research fellow position at the Australian National University. So please, Damian, you have the floor.
Slide, yeah. Okay. Well, it's okay. I think just to kind of set the foundation, I'm not really going to speak too much about the opportunities. I'm going to just raise what I think is one of the key issues. So I'm going to focus in on the GDPR in particular and how a smart city context actually fits within it, and more particularly in relation to the personal data definition and then the slippery slope towards the sensitive data category. So just as a brief overview, you have the definition of personal data in Article 4.1 of the GDPR, and it's well documented in academic literature in this area that it's an extremely broad definition. Yeah. So you had Nadia Petova suggest, she presented it on a panel in this room a few years ago, that this it's quickly becoming the law of everything. Yeah. And the definition then, or the special categories of data, are provided in Article 9, with this as a prohibition against the processing of such categories. So the argument, and this is based on work that I've done with Megan Richardson at University of Melbourne and Norman Wheatstep at Monash University, is that everything it can be quickly sensitive, yeah. So inferences through the big data analytics, etc., especially in the smart city context, you can quite quickly drip into the sensitive data category and then result in a prohibition of that processing subject to exemptions. And that results in extremely difficult issues in terms of the legal compatibility or compliance of smart city applications with the GDPR. And I just want to raise this as a potential issue because I have no idea how they're actually doing it, practically speaking. So I'll give you two examples of applications from my own PhD research, which I completed. But so these are smart advertising panels which supposedly detect emotion. Now there are some question marks as to whether they process personal data at all, because they don't react at an individual level. They detect on the basis of a group of people, so about 10. And without storage, etc., it's very difficult to see whether they can be cross-analyzed with other data in order to render someone identifiable. But if it does fall into the definition of personal data, then it's a very slippery slope again to the sensitive data category, because our emotions, for instance, they'll probably use biometric data, which is covered within the definition of what's provided in the sensitive personal data category. In addition to that, emotions might be considered health data, for instance, depending on the context. So you can see the potential problem, yeah? And in smart city context, where it's quite, I suppose, increasingly common to see some processing of biometric indicators, like through smart cameras, etc., I'm really starting to wonder a little bit about whether these things are actually being properly considered or not. Now, because within, I suppose, when you're processing normal personal data, there are various grounds that you can rely on. In a smart city context, you might be looking at public interest, which is Article 6.1, or potentially a legitimate interest processing ground. But these kind of disappear when you're in the sensitive personal data category. Obviously, you cannot rely on consent, given the burden that is required of controllers in order to prove that consent is legitimate in the context of the GDPR. So you're left with a public interest ground, which requires a law or some measure adopted by either the EU or a member state. So are these decisions being taken? Has the law actually been, are they legitimizing some of this processing that's actually happening? And in reality, is there a data protection impact assessment being conducted on the basis of that legal provision, which provides a basis for this processing in a smart city context? So I know I'm just raising issue and questions, but I think that they're extremely important, and I haven't seen any thorough analysis which answers them. So I think that's, I'll leave it at that, and I can expand with questions. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Damian, for showing this important impact of legal ground qualification of data with regards to accountability. And we will continue the discussion with Professor Lilian Edwards, who will actually raise more issues, I guess, also in the context of controllership. Professor Lilian Edwards is a professor of law, innovation and society at the Newcastle. I think I have to change the slides. Yeah. At the Newcastle Law School. So more recently, she's been working on the expanding notion of the data controller in the light of case law and the implication of that widening notion, especially in decentralized setups. So please, Lilian, you have the floor.
Okay.
Yes,
right.
This is it. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe she can read from there.
Yeah, I can't go read from there, but it's no worries.
Okay, no.
It's fine. It was fine.
Wait. It's because I've got this clicker. Can I just do it from there?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Let's see if this one works. Yes, right. Okay, I've got more slides, but I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. I'm really justifying, because I know that the raison d'etre of the panel is, to some extent, can we move towards doing something interesting with a data protection impact assessment for smart cities, which gives you this more external perspective, looking at a smart city perhaps as a conurbation of surveillance, of CCTV, of smart transport. These are the kind of issues you tend to think about, perhaps waste management, perhaps bins, perhaps lighting, and so forth. But my work, and I would argue, is equally important, has been looking at the context of the smart home within the smart city. So we're moving from the external, as it were, to the domestic. And of course, many of us already live in these homes. So without going into all of this, you can see really what I'm sometimes calling the 3 stages of the development of smart homes, that of smart cities, that we've moved, as I say, from this concern with external surveillance, such as smart CCTV, smart transport cars, surveillance in the workplace, smart doors, smart gates, all the rest of it, to domestic embedding. And it's gone from being this joke, the dream of the smart fridge, when we will all have a smart fridge, to reality. Indeed, I saw the other day, this has now been rolled out, several people have commented on it, that they have bought a fridge which will not give them iced water unless they sign up and pay extra for, you know, ice as a service for it to be delivered to them. And this is quite remarkable. And you're seeing similar tweaks with dishwashers, with other white goods, right? We've also seen in recent months, that's me talking about the external again, that's the smart lamppost in Hong Kong. We've moved in recent months or years through a series, really, of consumer-oriented scandals about the degree of non-transparency of surveillance by smart objects within the home. So we've had a series of worries about smart toys, about smart baby alarms that could be hacked so that people could, you know, talk rude words through them to your small children. Then we kind of moved on to another series more recently of moral panic stories about Alexa, Facebook portal, OK Google, that these objects were also listening to you despite, you know, vociferous claims that they weren't. Then it turned out that they were, but only to improve the training of the smart speaker and so forth. Without going into the details of that, we have become aware again of the problems of the smart home model for the internal privacy of users, you know, hampered by the usual problems of a lack of transparency, a lack of meaningful consent, a lack of accountability, et cetera, et cetera. So that, again, I haven't got time to go through, but that's a very interesting slide from my former colleague Ian Brown about the fact that you may say, well, having my data collected in the home isn't a very big deal. I don't care if you know about my smart fridge, you know, being used at 2 in the morning. I don't really care if you know that my smart doorbell was pressed at 4 a.m. But in fact, you can draw inferences from that kind of data, sometimes with other data, to produce extraordinarily worrying and privacy invasive data that can lead to a lot of very difficult questions. So what I can actually talk about very briefly is the work that I've been doing with colleagues, with Derek Macaulay, who's one of the people who's built DataBox, which is one of the leading kind of academic experiments in personal data containers in the UK right now. Should be said, DataBox has not yet been rolled out as anything other than a series of academic papers, so it doesn't, for example, have terms of service yet, which is rather unhelpful. And also with Jahong Chen, who's also at Nottingham now, and Lachlan Urquhart, who's at Edinburgh. And what we started to look at, to some extent, was where does the accountability and the responsibility lie with connected smart objects in the home, and particularly, how does the law deal with a possible solution? So this is taking you on to a third step, which is using a data box-like architecture. So sometimes known as personal data containers, PDCs. The idea of things like DataBox, and also others are available, MyDex, HAT, various other ones. Helene Jansen over there has written a really great paper looking at this widespread of new PDCs or PIMs. The idea is that this might help by allowing the data subject, the user of the smart home, to keep their data within the smart home and to do local processing. So it's basically an example of what people are generically calling edge computing, which is very trendy right now. Okay, so the idea is this will protect your privacy. This will therefore help with transparency and accountability and all these goals by having no leakage to the cloud. So it's the opposite of the centralized model of processing. It's decentralized edge computing. However, this is where it connects to the sort of stuff that Damian was talking about. This raises enormous problems. When you start talking to some of, not all, of the technological people involved in this, they go, this is great, it's fine, because like DataBox, let's just say, it's not a data controller, it's not even a legal entity, it has no role to play here. It's a tool, it's a pen, it's like Microsoft Word, you know, or it's a notepad. Right? It has no role. And I went, no, I don't think so. And the data subject, often people think, will be protected from any data protection duties, consequences, accountability by that what's known as the domestic or household exemption, right? However, that is probably really not true either. And we have a very long paper, I'm afraid, analyzing this, which is submitted to a journal right now, but right now you can read it in full on SSRN. So just again to raise questions rather than answers, maybe we can talk about some of the answers and questions. We have huge issues here in this multi-party situation as to who is just a data subject. In fact, in other words, they only have rights, not responsibilities. Is the personal data container, such as DataBox, a controller itself? Does it have even, some kind of legal status? Is it a processor acting for the user? Is it a processor acting for the service provider? So say the person, like TripAdvisor is often the example, instead of sending your data to TripAdvisor, TripAdvisor might provide an app to the DataBox ecosystem, which allows the local instance running in the user's home on DataBox to produce the inferences they want, giving them a ranking of the cheapest trips for the journey they want to take, right? So we have three parties. We have the data subject, the app provider, and the personal data container. And of the three of these, what are they? Which one is a data subject? Which one, if any, is a data processor? Which one is a data controller? Or are they, as the law is often pushing us towards right now, all joint controllers? Because, again, cannot go into it all. It would go, 20 minutes. We have had this series of CJEU cases from Wirtschafts Academy onwards that are pointing towards a much wider concept of joint controllership for some kind of associated set of operations than we've previously had in the law, where we had much more of an old-fashioned kind of 80s mainframe model, really, of a data controller and a data processor that acts for them as an agent. So that's the first set of problems that I've identified there. And clearly, I'm sure most people in the room know, if you are a joint controller, rather than just being, say, a data subject, then that is going to put you in pole position for a number of significant obligations, such as subject access rights, or the right to be forgotten, people asking for their data to be deleted, or the accountability obligation. So then, as I say, you might say, well, the user in the home, they were never meant to have these obligations. They're kind of the passive object. They're not a data controller making money out of this. Surely they benefit from the generic exception to the GDPR of the household exemption. And that was what was presented to me. But again, from the way the case law has been going in relation to the household exemption, that looks unlikely. Because although you can find some examples, some use cases of this kind of technology, say drawing inferences about the heating level in the house is an obvious one. So it just uses heating reads out, thermostat reads out within the house and adjusts the settings of your smart heating. Okay, maybe that's all internal. But almost everything else that's useful will involve some kind of flow of data outwards. Now, how much data is going to depend really on the terms of service between the app provider, data box, and the data subject. And as I say, unfortunately, we're not in the position really of being able to scrutinize those yet. But I think you have to say, as a generic feeling, particularly when you look at the Rhinus case about CCTV that looked onto the space outside the house, that the household exemption is unlikely to apply in very many instances of using these PDCs, because there will be a sense in which the processing is directed outwards. And a final point about that I'd make is you might say, well, it doesn't matter because you're not going to sue yourself, right? If you're the user of the smart home, you're not going to sue yourself for your right to be forgotten. But there are going to be other people whose data is collected, and this is already becoming a societal thing. If you have an Alexa in your house and you talk to it, and I just bought one for research purposes only, other people will wander into your house and start to play with your Alexa. As night follows day, they are like the new cats, right? So the data of other people is going to be collected. Similarly with heating, similarly with lighting, the visitors to your house, your children, using metaphorically, I don't have any children, there is going to be collection of data and processing of data of other people than the account holder on the personal data container. So this is not a purely academic question, and particularly in relation to children's rights, is one I think we need to start thinking about now. Okay, so I know that's a big information dump, but maybe we can go on to things and questions. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Lilian. So we are seeing a lot of challenges, and we're going to change the perspective from the legal research to a more technical point of view, and to see whether indeed a technical point of view can maybe provide some solutions. So Nicolas, I'm going to hand over the floor to you. So Dr. Nicolas Kourtellis, he holds a PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of South Florida, and currently working at Telefonica Research. So Nicolas, you have the floor.
Hi everybody. So my background is more technical, so not on the legal side, but I'm invited to maybe give some ideas on technical issues that may be arising in these topics. So as has been mentioned, I work in Telefonica Research in Barcelona. My focus is more on web transparency, understanding what type of leakage is maybe happening on the web from your device when you browse the web, especially when you are encountering advertisement. Now, with respect to the smart cities, everybody knows these dimensions, so I'm not going to go over them. I just wanted to point them out that when we talk about smart cities, we're talking about a very complex type of environment that goes beyond, let's say, the IoT or smart home. It goes into your transportation, your utilities, the public spaces planning. So it covers a lot of dimensions of our lives. And when we talk about making this space smart, we need to cover a lot of aspects. Now, when we start drilling more into the privacy and security aspects of this space, I wanted to point out a couple of things. So one is various incidents that we have noticed in the last few years that reflect maybe accidental, maybe malicious type of hacking that happened on IoT devices, especially in households. We have probably heard the example of a nearby hacker getting into the camera of a smart camera of a house and actually talking to the owner. Maybe this was accidental, maybe it was malicious, or smart toys. There is, I'm not going to go through the examples, but the point is that we can have this kind of security problems, because this is a security problem that also can translate into a privacy problem. Now, when we walk into the next bullet, which is the tracking, this becomes, in my opinion, something maybe benign, maybe. Sometimes it can turn malicious. And what do I mean by tracking? So in my work, we've done a lot of reverse engineering of the various protocols that the advertising ecosystem is using to track people. So you may all have heard of a real-time bidding protocol. How many have heard of this? How many people have heard of cookie synchronization? Okay. How many people have heard of cross-device tracking? That's good. How many people have heard of header bidding? All right. So these are all protocols that the advertising ecosystem is using to basically track, monitor the users on the web, understand what they like or what they don't like, or what I call their profiling, and then deliver something, right? So in general, this can be ads, it can be some recommendations, for example, a streaming service or whatever. It can be delivered through an ad as well, or it can be for you know, the movie that you may like more. So that's let's say a recommendation. All these things, I call them, let's say, something between the benign, malicious point of view, because there is a gray area of where do you draw the line on I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with that, right? So if I get a recommendation about the next movie, maybe it's okay, but if I'm recommended something more, let's say, personal, as a movie or as a product to buy, maybe I will feel that somebody is creeping out on my preferences, and I'm not okay with that. Moving on to the cross-device tracking, I've seen some people are aware of it. We have done some studies in the recent past to find how this cross-device tracking is happening. We've seen that it is basically possible in a few hours to detect if cross-device tracking is happening to you. Of course, we were not using actual users, we were using personas, so let's say bot-like type of activities to have competitive, behavior that is controlled and it can be studied on purpose. But we have done that on phones, laptops, tablets, or these kind of devices. But then moving into the smart cities or smart homes type of setup, I mentioned here a few examples. So what's going to be next, right? So we have a lot of IoT devices in the home. So will you be okay being cross-device tracked when your TV is listening and is tracking you? We already started seeing some studies coming out on that. What about the fridge that Lilian mentioned? What about your car, right? So now more and more cars are connected and they can basically report what you like, what you don't like, where you parked, where you were speeding. All your preferences can be up for sale. What about your bicycle? What about the clothes, right? So we started hearing about smart clothes. Monitor your temperature and doing some actions on that. So all these things are let's say, ways that the ad ecosystem can have an effect on you. And I can mention them later, but we have done some works, especially on the tracking and reverse engineering these protocols. Now, I want to bring, let's say, a semi-positive tone into this whole spectrum. In the last few years, we've had some evolution in the machine learning point of view. It's called privacy-preserving machine learning, and I raised just a couple of points here. So the first one I already mentioned. We need to have some methods to detect and block when there is leakage of PII to unauthorized third parties. And parenthesis here, there is some study that came out from Imperial College and Northeastern last year that talked about how they studied about 80 smart home devices, especially TVs and some other devices, and they have shown how many third parties are actually being exposed to your data. So I can give you the pointer later, but these showed how we are definitely not ready for this type of leakage. Now, going to the next bullet, which is federated learning, or especially federated deep learning, this is, let's say, a method where you can optimize your machine learning model in a distributed fashion so that, as Lilian mentioned about keeping your data in your house through a data box or some other means, you need to find a way to, if you are the advertiser or if you are the one who wants to monitor people, how can you build a model that you don't really get access to the data? Well, these kind of methods, so federated learning and also differential privacy, are methods that allow a third party to be able to build some sort of audience where they can target, but without really knowing who the person is. And this is where differential privacy and federated learning can be combined. It's already, I think last year we had a paper, not us, but there was a paper from the community on this topic. But the summary of this is that these kind of techniques allow companies that we all hate right now, monitoring us and targeting us. We think that there are other ways, other alternatives to stay in the business without violating the user's privacy. In fact, Google, for example, is one of the ones that invest a lot in deep learning. They are using it actively in some of their products. So they are showing that it's possible to be done. Of course, it's Google, so they have a lot of resources to invest on that. But at the same time, the methods are there, so we want the rest of the million type of companies that are out there and monitoring us and tracking us and sharing data or selling data to follow suit and make sure that they don't have these violations. And finally, just to, I guess, give some more questions for us and the audience. The first question that I came to mind when I was looking to this topic, how do we collect consent when we are in a public space. So you walk into a park, and the city wants to turn this park into a smart park. How do you collect a consent when somebody walks in? I don't know. It's a very, very difficult question. There was actually an effort in Toronto the last few years where they're trying to build a waterfront that is it's a smart, let's say, smart city type of waterfront, and a subsidiary of Alphabet bid, and they won the competition, and they had a big problem the last couple of years trying to figure out how to resolve the problem of privacy. One idea that they thought was de-anonymizing at the source. So it goes closer to what I mentioned earlier with the federated learning. You basically build a model locally at the device. So in this case, for example, it could be the sensor, it could be the camera, it could be any monitoring, let's say, type of device. And then you send a pre-model. You send something that is not exposing the user per se, but it gets aggregated. Another question, we know that we have asymmetricity in the data. So people out there have no idea how much data is collected by the companies. So there is this asymmetricity, and this actually is being taken advantage of by all these companies. So when we walk out, we know how many people see us, and this is a one-to-one type of relationship. But when we are on the web, the whole thing is changing. Furthermore, how do we regain trust of users when it comes to the digital data collection and the use of this data? There is definitely need more effort on the regulatory part. We need to make sure that the government bodies have deep expertise in these topics. We cannot afford government bodies that are actually voting for regulations not to know, not to have experts in this field. And furthermore, we need to get the companies on board with the whole concept of privacy. So we need more companies being able to get advocating privacy for the users and figure out how to make a business out of that instead of making money out of users' data without users' consent. And finally, there is a question of how do you educate users about smart city initiatives. So I was reading how many initiatives are out there, and there have been studies where people have no idea that their city is a smart city, or they have active smart city initiatives. That means that there is no awareness of even the citizens that live in the city alone, never mind the tourists, right? So maybe they know even better because they read something about their city, about the city they're visiting, but the locals who live in a city, they are not being informed, either actively or through some interest. I know I laid down some extra questions, but I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for giving us a perspective on solutions that enable us to share data without violating the user's privacy. We would also like to add the perspective of Data Protection Authority to the panel, and I would like to welcome Gerald Hopster. He is a senior inspector at the Dutch Data Protection Authority, and we're very happy that he's willing to share some insights on the exploratory study that the Dutch DPA is running at the moment on smart cities. So please, yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you. The slides are...
Yeah.
They're quite minimalistic, so...
Yes.
It's here, 4, yeah. Number 4. Yeah, second.
Tell me the name.
You.
I do inspect. So, well, I'm not going to inspect.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name is Gerald Hopster. I'm a senior inspector of the Dutch Data Protection Authority. And I'm going to talk about smart cities and accountability in smart cities. We're currently conducting an investigation into smart cities and accountability principle in smart cities in the Netherlands. And we are calling it a compliance investigation. You can also call this an exploratory study. What we are doing is looking at how accountability is being counted in smart cities. So how are they using the DPIA in the development process? How is data being gathered in the public space? So that's only, I think, the first bullet of what Nicolas showed just now, because it's not about mobility, it's not about the infrastructures, it's about the sensors in the public space in general. And this is also the focus of the Dutch DPA for the following few years. And, well, I'm quite curious, because I think it's a very good question that Nicolas just asked. How are we going to educate the citizens of smart cities? Because some of them don't know. We have quite a good view on Brussels here, and I think a lot of you have no idea what techniques are being used to follow you around the city, to gather data about your movements, about what you are doing, about the air quality, and a lot of this data is personal data. So if we don't know what is going to happen when we leave this building, how would a normal citizen that's not as interested in privacy as we are know what they can do to gain control in their data? So that's quite a good question, actually. So we are all aware that the urban environment is getting more smarter by means of technology. All the sensors that are being placed in the public space to pick data up, or picking data up from you, from me, and from everyone around us. And this data often has the ability to be traced back to a person. So this is personal data under the GDPR. During this conference, a lot of panelists have already said that we are the data they collect. We are the citizens that are being gathered in data. So we also have to be able to hold them into account. That's the reason that the Dutch DPA started a compliance investigation into smart cities and smart city projects in the Netherlands. What are we doing? Well, we are conducting an investigation, not into the possible breach of GDPR, but we want to know what the system of accountability is in these cities. Consequently, we are requesting DPIAs and additional information about from a variety of cities, ranging from bigger cities to smaller cities in the rural parts of the Netherlands. Our aim is to have a general impression of the state of accountability, and we want to have this in the summer of this year. What we will probably do is publish additional guidance, and also we hope to encounter possible best practices to share about this topic, so we can spread the word on how you can do this as a city. This investigation is also part of a focus as the Dutch DPA. One of the focal points is digital government, and under digital government you can see smart cities as one of the focal points. Well, we also have Internet of Things as one of the focal points, but they are under data brokering, but it's all connected with each other. Mobility, data brokering, Internet of Things, digital government, it's all connected in the end. So as a lot of you will know, the data protection impact assessment is one of the main elements of the accountability under the GDPR. However, what we see in smart city projects that are being implemented, sometimes they are being implemented without a proper impact assessment. Sometimes there is not even an impact assessment at all. Therefore, what the Dutch DPA has done is made an impact assessment mandatory for smart cities under the Dutch GDPR Implementation Act. And when we add the multi-layer or multi-actor smart layer cities, or how are we going to call this, to this, you can see that it gets even harder for a citizen to be in control of their own data. A lot of these multi-actor projects are opaque at best. There's almost no way of knowing who is exactly gathering your data, and how can you get to it? How can you get control of your personal data that's somewhere being collected in the city? Therefore, the cities just need to step up their game and make an effort to be accountable for all this data and the collection of data, and also the collection of data under their watch. And also, well, here's something to ponder. Are smart cities different to other types of data processing in applying the accountability framework? Well, my personal opinion is smart cities are essentially the same as other technology-based collections. What is different is the scale of this data collection and the involvement of multiple authorities, multiple parties, public and private. what you see is this complicates the system of accountability. And the system of accountability poses challenges for creating a good impact assessment. The best advice we can give here is to develop a higher level of transparency. From the very beginning, from the start of every project, this has to be a core element of your projects, of your project plan, and of your working methods. What we observe is that the working methods are being developed for accountability at this moment in smart cities, but creativity will be needed. Creativity will be needed in developing these methods, and we want to say here, be creative, not afraid. What we see in a lot of cities is that they are afraid. They don't know if they are a controller, if they are a processor, what do we have to do here? We have more actors than one, so we don't do anything. That's not the way forward. You have to do something. You have to be creative. You know how the city works, and you know why you are collecting this data. So show some accountability and start working on this. Also, keep an eye on the risks that may vary during the lifespan of a project, and also stick to the privacy by design principle. Privacy by design principle is not always perfectly clear, but it gives some guidance on how you can do this, and also it gives some guidance on what are the basic principles, how you can start these projects. Also, in spite of these costs and additional efforts that it may take, smart city projects that respect data protection are less likely to lose the trust of the citizens. They're also more sustainable, have a longer lifespan, and are more beneficial to society. So that's a good question Nicolas just asked. How are we going to educate the citizens of these smart cities? And I think one of the ways is to promote the transparency of all these projects. We have to know what they are doing, how they are doing it, and where we can go if we want to get access to our data. So in conclusion, using accountability for data protection, this is also the last slide. Using the accountability for data protection is a core element for all smart cities, not just in the Netherlands, but in the whole of Europe. And I think it will be the core element for smart cities in the future. Because if you don't know how to be accountable, if you're not transparent, you're not going to create a smart city that falls under the GDPR, but is also accepted by citizens. Citizens have to have trust in these cities. Without trust, the cities just fall apart. So that's essentially what we need. Thank you for attending this panel. I'm hoping for some good questions and a good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Thank you for stressing the importance of transparency, and we look very much forward to the results of this investigation. And as a last speaker, we would like to welcome Antonio Kung. Antonio is CTO at Trialog, and he is also currently the editor of the ISO standards 27550 on privacy engineering. Antonio, please, you have the floor. Get your slides. View, yes, yeah.
Control L. Control L. Good afternoon. Yeah, actually, I'm actually the CEO of the company now. Doesn't matter. Okay. In one slide, I want to show how I see the ecosystem of smart cities. Okay, so we have the municipality, the stakeholder, so they have some responsibility or accountability. Okay, so they are managing many applications, many. Okay, some of them separate, some of them they share. Okay, and for each application, I'm taking my modest viewpoint of how legally you see it. Okay, you have the citizen. Maybe he gave his consent. Yeah, he did give his consent to the data controller. So then the data controller might have given a contract to a data processor. So there's some agreement. But they are not alone, actually. There are other companies. So some of them quite big. So the integrator, maybe he's not even data controller or data processor. He does it. And then there are suppliers. And maybe the suppliers in the supply chain is the biggest. And yet the data controller is here. Okay, So the picture is clear, and the data controller, data processor, they follow GDPR, they follow privacy obligations. The integrator gets the requirements, probably know the purpose. He will apply PIA or DPIA, depends on people how they mention it. Privacy by design, PBD, okay. And the supplier, he gets the requirements, sometimes he doesn't know the purpose. So you can sell a camera, a video center camera, you can sell storage. You do not know who is using it. You might still suspect that it could contain personal data, okay? And the municipal stakeholder has to manage the request to the citizen, maybe to have an understanding of all the PIAs that exist in the ecosystem, of the agreements for data exchange, and the contracts that he might have had with operators that are operating for the system, okay? So this is complicated, and when you have accountability, what happens, okay? We don't know at that point, okay? The only good example I can tell is what happens about automobiles, okay? When you have a problem, an OEM, we call them OEM, he will recall the cars, okay? We all know, okay? And someone will pay. In general, the consumer doesn't pay, okay? So who is paying? Okay? At the end of the day, it's the insurance company, okay? But which insurance company? It's the insurance company of the company in the supply chain who was the problem, okay? So what they do is actually, when they have an issue, recall, they will try to track where it happened and who is the liable, accountable, okay? And who have to pay. And of course, since it has to work, they don't want to get bankrupt, they get insurance, okay? This is what we have to achieve for the future, okay? And the second, so this ecosystem issue, okay? The second issue I want to mention is the governance, okay? Because who is deciding, okay? So we know it's complex, we know we have data controllers, but who is deciding? So I have 3 pictures, and I want to show on the left, this is what an example of an ecosystem governance model, okay? So you have the governing stakeholder, who is he, okay? He will apply a process to decide about policies, okay? So basically, governance is about deciding policies which you will ask other people to apply and to enforce, okay? And then, of course, you have to check, to verify, to monitor so that actually works properly, okay? So this is governance model for everything. But when it comes to smart city, we're going to wonder whether the smart city is not the governing stakeholder or part of it, okay? And he has to apply a governance process. I give an example here. So he's monitoring a smart transport operator. It's not him, it's another company, okay? But he has established privacy policies, and he wants the smart transport operator to apply in his life cycle in the system those policies, okay? Because, of course, probably the smart transport operator is managing data about customers, okay? Now, I want to give, so this actually we can understand, but then there are issues that are new, in particular autonomous vehicles, okay? So autonomous vehicle is something that might make autonomous decisions, okay? But those decisions must be based on some policies, okay? So again, who established the policies? So what is the governance, okay? So on top you have the vehicle manufacturer. The vehicle manufacturer must apply a governance process. But is the vehicle manufacturer the governance body? I would say no. It cannot be that an auto manufacturer is making those kind of decisions, okay? So we have the issue in a smart city, but generally speaking, to understand the governance process and who is behind the governance process, okay? So those are news. I'm not saying we solve it, but at least we can understand the issues. And this is what we try to capture in this standard, okay? 27570, okay? Privacy guideline for smart cities. Basically, in a nutshell, what it says is think about it and make a decision how to work properly, okay? And it is a little bit more structured, so you explain governance, you explain risk management. So you have here 5 processes. One, the most important, is the governance, okay? And in the governance, the first question is, what is the governance body and how do I apply it, okay? So the smart cities, they have to think about it and decide, okay? So this is the first step. The second is, of course, so data sharing. So how do we manage it, okay? And some people say you should say data processing process, okay? So we can change, okay? And of course, the risk management. The risk management is related to DPIAs. But actually, it's the sum of all the DPIAs, because in an ecosystem, it's just not one company. It's not just the smart city. It's a smart city, the operators, the suppliers, the integrators. Some of them must, and I'm happy that it's enforced in the Netherlands, must do a DPIA. But maybe many of others must also do it. Okay, that's quite important. Okay, then you have the engineering process. So it's again educational. You want people who are developing the system to apply privacy by design. So the engineering process of a smart city application must include that. Okay, we have one issue is that it's not one system that we are designing. It's what we call a system of systems. Okay, and system of systems are things we don't understand well. Even the technical people, I can tell you, at standardization level, we try to describe it. But one thing that is important that they say is that in a system of systems, you have emerging risk. That actually each system has a risk, but if you put them together, you have further risk. Okay, so someone has to make the DPIA of the system of systems. Okay, so that's quite important. Okay? And of course, guideline for citizen engagement process, because actually you need to have trust. Okay. So in a nutshell, we have one picture here that shows how it's a simplified, and we can refine it because it's a starting point, that you must have something like that where you have an ecosystem governance body that is somehow discussing with organization. They are part of the club, the community, and you agree on the solution. So I'm using this term from EDPS, best available techniques. We cannot solve and cannot find the perfect things, but we can at least discuss and agree, okay? And this is the objective. And because life is changing and the application is changing, you must apply continuous agreement, okay? Improvement. So those are the two principles. First of all, best available techniques in the community, in the ecosystem, and try to invent a process to make it happen, and then continuous improvement. Okay. Thank you, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And now we're hoping that all these inputs have inspired you to ask us a lot of questions. So I'm going to open the floor now to the audience to ask questions to the panelists. Yes, I'm not sure. We have a mic. It's on its way. Could I please ask you to maybe shortly state your name and your affiliation so we have a bit of background? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stuart Dresner. I'm Chief Executive at Privacy, Laws and Business, the publication and events company. And my question is to Gerald regarding the Netherlands. You referred to various smart cities in the Netherlands. You are dealing with both large and small. So could you give us some examples of larger and smaller cities that you are engaging with? And the question is, how have they responded? The civil servants who run smart city programs in those cities, how are they responding to your questions? And are they making many amendments to their programs in response to your points?
Thank you for this question. Well, it's an ongoing investigation, so I can't comment yet on which cities we are doing. What we are trying to get is like a mix of bigger and smaller cities, but also a geographic mix because the challenges are quite different. A challenge in the cities is more like mobility, safety, air quality, but in smaller cities you see that they tend to focus more on smaller mobility problems, other types of safety problems, sometimes even agricultural appliances. So we try to get an overview of what are all the ways that it's being used, what is exactly the smart city, because the definition question of smart city is quite a big one. So we try to see what is exactly happening. And I can't give an overview of what is going to happen yet, because we are in the middle of the investigation now. But we are hoping that we can nudge them towards seeing that this is very important, that they have to be accountable, and this is not something that can be at the end of this process, like, oh, we also have to do a DPIA. It has to be the start, but also like the main core of how they can be accountable. And if you use a DPIA in the way it should be done, I think it can be really beneficial for an organization, because then they see what are exactly the elements that you have to do, but also you have to reach the citizens. So how are you going to educate them? Well, first tell them what you are going to do, see how they react. And I hope we can give them more guidance on how they can do this. See also what parts of the DPIA are not clear yet, where are the questions about this, and hope that we can give them enough food for thought to just get to the next level and take some steps to make this better. But we hope to give a bit more information this summer. Thank you.
Yeah, this one there.
Ah, sorry.
Thanks. My name is Oskar Steinheimer from the University of Groningen. I'm interested in your perspectives on dogmatic ways forward. So should we stick with the current model of that we have in GDPR, or do you think that's not feasible? A concept that is out there that is always discussed and then not discussed at the same time is data ownership. Do you think that's useful to compensate people, to sort of make this argument, so if you actually have a commercial gain for yourself, then it's fine at the end of the day? Or I'm really interested and curious about your perspectives on this.
When it comes to data ownership, no, I don't think that that's a good thing. I mean, the point that I was trying to get across with this is that it's very much a public interest balancing. You know, I think the discussions around consent in a smart city context are a little bit confused, because under the GDPR you could just not give consent in that kind of context. It would just not work as a condition for lawful processing. So we need to start thinking of the balancing that would legitimize this type of activity, and that's what's very important, I suppose, about the data protection impact assessment. But I suppose the point I was trying to make as well in my contribution to this is the slippery slope into the sensitive data category, and we need to start thinking about you know, the processes that legitimize this at a kind of legislative or administrative decision or an executive order. What's the impact assessment that is being made there, which justifies this on a public interest ground as a lawful or, you know, against a prohibition if it's sensitive personal data that's processed. So I think you know there needs to be a lot more discussion around the lawfulness of these things, what they're actually relying on, practically speaking, even beyond just the accountability issues. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I'm not sure I've got solutions. I've got a number of solutions that I don't like very much. The underlying problem here is almost exactly the same as the problem that's being discussed extensively in the real-time bidding panels, which is that we have got, you know, a pandemic collection of information within these environments in a way that is almost definitively non-transparent. And the question of how you get people to consent validly to it seems to me, radically, I know, a question we should just stop asking. It is not up to the citizens in a smart city to give a better, more informed, more thought through consent. They have better things to do with their life. It is particularly apposite in a smart city as opposed to some kind of online system like social networking, because you simply cannot make a valid choice not to use the service. You can't really choose not to walk on the smart road or not to drive your car through the smart apparatus with the smart lamppost and the smart CTV and the smart ANPR license plates. Now, there are obviously exceptions to all the things I'm saying, because sometimes you're collecting that data for policing and crime and detection, and then you don't need consent. So I have a very large paper on this from 2016 that goes into all this. But if you take it at the basic level we've been talking about how to fiddle with consent, we should just stop fiddling with consent. Now, having said that, I was actually sitting here trying to work it out for myself. It is different from the real-time bidding type scenarios, because if you're just talking about building a 24/7 surveillance system to provide better ads, then I really do feel we've got to a point of ridiculousness. right? It's just ads. Okay, it's money, but there are other ways to get money. However, if you're talking about smart city, you may well be talking about the collection of data on a 24/7 non-transparent surveillance basis for public good, right? So there is much more room there for going into a decent balancing exercise. And that's why I've for 4 years asked, when is someone going to produce a decent, as you say, not just a DPIA for a smart city, but a collection, a hierarchical, interconnected, synergetic collection of DPIAs for a smart city. And I would really like to talk about this, and because I did write paragraphs quite like this in 2016, when Glasgow was allegedly a smart city, and I was involved with it because I was in Glasgow. So we need to have that conversation, but we have to stop couching this in terms of autonomy and consent and transparency. We just have to stop doing that. We have to stop saying the answer is to educate our citizens. They say that is not a responsibility that should be placed on our citizens. And the last thing I would say, actually, is come back to be even more annoying to the question about how are the civil servants dealing with this, is that certainly when I was slightly more involved in this 3-4 years ago, it was not the civil servants who were in control of the data. It was the private providers. It was the Ciscos and the Vodafones, and now it would be the Ubers and the Googles, right? You know, look at Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs is a small feudal sovereignty like Liechtenstein, run by Google in Toronto, and that's why there was pushback by the 9 people who understood what was going on. And, you know, and it's not even as if we have it that bad in the West. If you start going to the cities that are being built in India and China, you know, it's a toss-up whether they're owned by the government or by Vodafone or Cisco, but they're certainly not owned by the citizens, you know? So, yeah, that was a bunch of rants I had on my desk, but the net answer is don't rely on consent, and yes, let's do DPIAs.
If I can continue, because I agree with a lot of your points, because it's also a question about democracy, because you don't have to only educate your citizens. It's more like they have to know what's happening.
Yeah,
That's the main point. And the second one is the policy makers have to know what's going on, but also the politicians have to know what's going on and what they are doing. And I see that there's sometimes quite a lack of information about what is the effect of what they are doing.
Yeah. That's almost more like FOI than data privacy consent, though.
And that's exactly
that's
the point.
That's access to information.
That's why consent is sometimes used as a shortcut, but it's mostly not a shortcut. And what you can see is that internationally, if you have cities that start at a really a low level, bottom up, okay, we have a problem in the street, how can we solve this? Okay, there's a technical solution for this. Let us see if we can do this. That's mostly a way forward where there's not a lot of problems there, because there is a genuine problem in need of a solution, and there's not a product searching for a problem somewhere. And that's what you often see. Smart cities want to be a smart city, and then they are going to look for problems to solve.
Yeah, indeed.
And then you get a lot of problems, because how are you going to show that this is necessary? That's sometimes impossible. So yeah, that's quite a big problem. And that's the same with Google in Toronto, I think.
Yeah.
That's in search of a problem and in search of how to sell a product. So it's quite different.
Just want to add from a technical point of view. So we are dealing with complex systems, we all agree. Smart cities will integrate several complex systems. We need to have this overall understanding of the risk analysis. And when it comes to this, when it comes to building those systems, okay, we have what was something we call architecture, okay? So we have an architecture of how this is done, because without the architecture, we cannot understand the complexity, and its architecture is about this, okay? And we have to do the same for risk analysis, okay? You cannot get like 2,000 risks that in an Excel sheet. I was discussing with people on that this morning, and then try to figure out what's going on. You have to structure it, okay? And this is important. And I have to say, nothing is done right now on this, okay? And the technical will have this duty to provide hints about how you're going to architect your risk analysis, so that actually, at the right level, you make the right decisions. and you want to hide some other risks that are given at another level, okay? Of course, everything has to be traceable, but I think we should work on that. Okay.
Just to mention also a couple of things. So I will agree that the ad ecosystem right now is very complex. In fact, I always question the eco part of this word. I don't think it's ecosystem, because usually there is a win-win situation, and in the ecosystem this is not happening. Now, this type of systems have evolved into this complex type of structures with a lot of intermediaries, with a lot of companies that are playing very strange roles into the chain of data sharing. And yes, GDPR is coming in to create, let's say it's trying to create a change into this ecosystem. I think that's not going to be easy. We're talking about a lot of redesign, or a lot of architectures, a lot of protocols, a lot of methods. But actually, it brought also opportunities for new business models. So it's not only disrupting the way that the current ecosystem is working, but it's also bringing new opportunities for entrepreneurs to make new businesses. Now, if we allow the smart cities to replicate let's say the blueprint that the ad ecosystem has used so far and move into the smart cities, we're going to have the same problems, and even worse, because we are talking about multiple dimensions of problem. It's not just collecting your browsing history. It's, as you said, where you walk, where you enter, where you eat, how you do anything. So my opinion is that we have actually, right now, we have an opportunity when we start talking about smart cities and when we start talking about bringing architectures and systems and methods and everything into cities. We need to think from scratch and bring in privacy by design, you mentioned. We need to bring thinking into how do we design these spaces, how do we collect data without violating people's privacy. Maybe there's no easy way to get consent, yes. Maybe there's no need for consent, but then there is another question that comes to mind, data literacy. So a lot of people that are currently right now, they have no idea what is being collected. They are all these efforts that are trying to educate them and say, okay, your data is very important. You have to keep notice where you allow people to access your data. So bottom line is that we shouldn't let the problems, the mistakes and the problems that we allowed the ad ecosystem to do in the last 10, 20 years to come into play in the ad ecosystem, in the smart cities ecosystems.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Corrie Ebbers. I work as an independent privacy lawyer in the Netherlands. And because of that, I do have a question for Gerald. I'm going to read a few sentences, and then I'm going to ask you the question. The value of the public space is that you can move there anonymous. When you collect data in a public space, then it's no longer a public space, but it's a government space. So my question is, do you care about the public space?
Well, it actually is a good question, because you have to consider what is a public space. And the definition of public space is getting harder and harder to define, because what is exactly a public space and when is it a government space? Because you can say this is a government space, but if the government is cooperating with like 4 or 5 other semi-government organizations or private organizations, then it's a space of some organization that have some kind of power over you. So I don't think that we have to use the government citizen definitions because sometimes it is more about who has power over someone else, over an individual. It can also be if you walk into a shopping mall, for example, they can use a lot of surveillance technologies, but there's no government involved there. But it is a semi-public space. People think it is a public space because they can just enter it, walk through it, so they perceive it as a public space. But still, there's a private party there that's tracking you and tracing you. So that's quite interesting. When is it a public space or not? But we do care about public space. That's exactly why we are doing this investigation. Because I think it's a utopia to say you should never be traced, or you should never be there should never be a data gathering in public space, because that's not always possible. You do have safety issues, you do have environmental issues, and sometimes technology can be a good solution for that. But you have to think long and hard about how can you do this, who is going to do this, and how are you being accountable for this. And sometimes that's the government, but sometimes it's also a group of different organizations. And then you see that a lot of them are afraid of who is the processor, who is the controller, and who's being accountable. And that's where we say be creative, don't be afraid, because there are a lot of ways to solve this problem, but we don't see a lot of efforts to solve it in the end. So, does it answer your question?
Maybe we can talk afterwards.
Of course, we will.
Can I say a little bit? It's an interesting question, but it's a matter of who you regard as your enemy, because there's a conventional kind of surveillance studies angle on this, which is the state is your enemy, and we need the private place where the state can't see us. But actually, the evidence I've seen about the building of smart cities in the last 4, 5, 6 years has been often that the enemy are the private companies that are supplying the infrastructure, that are answering the tenders, that are providing the communications. Is this on? Yeah. One idea I've just been sitting here working, and maybe someone has worked on it, it's a new thought to me, is that one of the problems here is that this is largely constructed via private contracts and subcontracts. And that also doesn't help, as you say, with this delimitation of who's the controller, who's the processor, who's the joint controller, who has to fill out the DPIA, who answers the SARs, all the rest of it. It's extremely opaque, right? Maybe we need a top-down constitution for a smart city that lays down rules, a bit like a binding corporate rule that acts in place of an adequacy assessment. It's just a new thought, and maybe a basis of it is the PIAs that are going on and the ISO rules that we've just seen, which doesn't mean there wouldn't then be a network of contracts, but it might be a start. And the Constitution, this is totally thinking here, the Constitution could possibly be imposed as a condition of the tenders in smart cities in the ways that I know is going on when various services such as transport infrastructure are tendering in some cities. The condition is being made, for example, that they have to provide a certain amount of data to the municipality. So it's something also that Deirdre Mulligan has talked about the use of tenders and conditions and administrative law to try and leverage this kind of behavior. So these are blue sky thinking, yeah, as opposed to just arguing over Article 5.3 again.
Hello, my name is Koen Versmissen. I'm a privacy consultant from the Netherlands. I've had a question to Antonio Kung, but it's also very much related to the answers that have just been given. Because the slide's still up there. You propose, or ISO proposes to establish an ecosystem governance body. And my question basically is, should this be the municipality? And if not, how can you force such a governance body to come into existence and play a proper role?
That's a very good question, and actually the text doesn't say, because we don't know, okay? And it will depend on the... So yesterday I was in another conference on connected smart cities and communities, and the city of Helsinki, they presented an analysis they did, and they say, okay, we see 3 types of cities in the world. In North America, where actually private companies are somehow creating the agenda. Then you have China, where actually the government is creating the agenda. And then they mentioned Barcelona because, the Barcelona where actually they did a study and it's more citizen engagement, things like that, okay? So we don't know. This is international standard. We don't say how. But the idea is actually, since it is a complex, we need to agree. And the example you mentioned about having this kind of principles, this is a starting point of a governing body, okay? So people have to decide how they create the shape of this. What we say is it is needed. That's the only thing we say. Sorry for the question. Yes.
So how many lawyers are involved in drafting this as opposed to technical standards community?
So this is a big issue because standardization is actually very specialized. You can even say how many people knowing privacy were involved in this, or even how many people knowing about smart cities were involved in this project, okay? So initially, 0, because there were only security people, okay? So that's why I'm getting here. I'm trying to convince Natalie to help, things like that, because we want to have real feedback, okay? And this is the issue of standardization, by the way, that it's so specialized that transversal issues are never dealt with correctly. Sorry for that.
No, I say it actually in fellow feeling, because as someone who has worked on this and has worked quite a lot with technical communities, I would constantly run into people at drinks who would go, oh, you should come and be on a working group for this, but then I would never hear from them again. So there is, it's not, I think that wasn't just me, I think there is an issue of different communities that are just not bumping into each other at all, and it has to be said that the technical standards community does seem a very long way away from anywhere where lawyers and even other technologists often talk.
It's not solved at all.
No.
So it's also a challenge, another kind of challenge.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm still Stuart Dresner from Privacy Laws and Business, and my question is, meanwhile, while smart cities are developing, so is 5G. And my question is whether 5G makes the company's position stronger, such as Google in Toronto, and therefore citizens' position weaker. In other words, is 5G merely a technical thing, or is it so powerful and enables the gathering of so much data that the individual's position is weakened? Thank you. And that could be for any.
I think it's again a governance issue because at the end of the day, I was saying in the US maybe a private company dictates, but yes, the mobile operator, they might be very powerful here because they will be the first to provide services, and the citizen will like it. Okay, so at the end of the day, they will influence the whole thing. Okay, so I think it's a matter of this governing body to select himself and then to make the right choice. Okay, not sure whether it helps. That's a frustrating answer, but I really think that the governance body is the most important thing to decide upon.
Well, maybe I can pinch in here. Yes, 5G is very powerful as a technology, but I mean, we all know that it comes with great responsibility, right? So depending on how you use it, or if you just give blank card to the companies to play with it, or be allowed to use it for whatever reasons, there's going to be a problem or not. So I will agree with you. It's a matter of governance as well as coming up with proper, like you have process structures to follow on how it's going to be used. If Google is going to be allowed to, sprinkle millions of sensors in Toronto and then use 5G to actually have the connectivity and collect data, that's a problem of who let them do that. So if the technology allows you to do it, it's not the problem, right? Because we can have a lot of examples of that. So I don't think that's the way to see it. The way to see is, yes, it comes with a lot of capabilities as a technology. Maybe the fact that people don't know about it a lot will give some leverage to companies to take advantage of that and make use of data collection without knowing. But if you have proper process on checking who is collecting the data or how, where they're getting stored, all the things that we could consider GDPR related, I think it should be fine.
And I can, well, one small remark, that's also, you see here that there's also a world politic level argument here, because you see that there are 3 models currently that are being used in the world, kind of. But it depends on how do you want to use this. So there's a question of ethics and morality behind it. Are you going to make rules as Europe, as Netherlands, as cities in the Netherlands, how it's going to be used? Or are you going to let everything to the market? Because then you can see that the market gains power, and it always gains power in a way that you have to regulate afterwards. So there's a big question there, when are you going to regulate this, and exactly how, and how are you going to standardize this, and who is influencing these standardizations? Are these the companies, are these other countries, or do we do this as Europe? That's a big question.
So just one last thing I want to mention is that when the smart cities, they get together. So there was this conference and they make announcement, and sometimes a list of cities, they will get together and sign something common, okay? And this is one way. So just not to have just the Dutch or the French, the Italian thing. So sometimes we have common problems, and maybe you have common solutions, okay? Yeah. And I think this is really where the smart cities represent the citizens, and then they get together and they try to find something that is common.
Okay, yes, thank you all. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the panel. Our time's run out, and we're going to close the panel here. So I'd like to thank you very much, all of the panelists, for your very interesting presentations and contributions. Thank you all the audience for your attention and your interesting questions. And thank you very much to the SPECTRE team for organizing the panel, with special thanks to Athena and Ellen. So let's join me all in applause.